The first time I tell you this, it will feel unreal. But that is the point. What you are about to hear is a secret the world was never meant to know, buried in the empty hills of Texas, in a time when law, morality, and reason were powerless against isolation. March of 1854. A lone doctor rode 7 hours into the wilderness, following a trail that disappeared into dense cedar and limestone ridges, where no neighbor could hear a scream, and no law could intervene. He was summoned to a place the map barely recorded, a ranch hidden in the folds of the Pedernales River. What he found there would haunt him for decades. The house itself was a fortress, built of limestone and shadow, silent in a way that made the horse tremble. Inside, every room was ordered, clean, obedient to a pattern he could not yet see. But the silence, the unnatural, oppressive silence, was what chilled him first. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of control. Every footstep echoed authority. Every glance, unseen, seemed to watch him back. He had entered a world where one man's will was absolute, and the rest moved like shadows in his presence. The patriarch of this house spoke with calm certainty, quoting scripture as a shield, as justification, as law. "What is here," he said, "is not for the world. You are a witness and nothing more." His voice carried the weight of centuries of unchallenged dominion, a man unbound by law, morality, or human convention. The doctor would later write, trembling in his journal, that he had never seen submission so complete, obedience so total, that the human spirit could bend so completely without question. Outside the walls, the frontier stretched endlessly. The land promised freedom, yet inside this house, freedom had been erased. Isolation was no longer geography. It was a psychological prison. And beyond isolation lay silence, the deeper force. Records would vanish, witnesses would disappear, and for decades, history would pretend nothing had occurred. Yet hints remained, fragments in burned courthouse documents, coded letters, whispered confessions, a legacy of control that refused to die. And now you are on the threshold. You see the first layer of what others pretended to ignore. The world believes in justice, in law, in the protection of the innocent. But there are places where power is absolute, where secrecy is its own universe, and where a single man's belief can bend reality itself. Watch closely, listen carefully, because the knowledge you gain here changes everything. Once you step through, there is no returning to ignorance. You must understand something before we go any deeper. Isolation is not just distance. It is a tool, a weapon, a slow, patient erasure of alternatives. And on the Texas frontier in 1854, isolation was more powerful than any sheriff, any church, any government. It was the perfect environment for a man with absolute conviction and no equal to sharpen his will into a kind of private law. That was the world. Josiah Hargrove built a self-contained kingdom, a domain where the outside world existed only as rumor, and where his voice echoed without resistance. For years, the Hargrove daughters were ghosts to the surrounding county. People assumed they were sickly, shy, withdrawn. But no one questioned too deeply. Frontier families respected privacy to a fault, and Josiah knew how to cloak control under the language of righteousness. He quoted scripture the way generals quote battle orders, precise, commanding, unchallengeable. To the merchants in Fredericksburg, he was simply eccentric. To his rare acquaintances, he was old-fashioned. But to the doctor who finally stepped inside his walls, the truth was unmistakable. Josiah had used isolation to create a psychological kingdom where he was prophet, judge, and executioner of reality itself. The doctor would later write that the daughters did not simply obey, they reflected their father's worldview, as though their minds had been shaped by the architecture of the house. Their movements were synchronized, voices muted, expressions unreadable. Submission wasn't enforced by threat. It was bred through absence of contrast, absence of alternatives, absence of anyone who dared say, "This is not normal." That is how control operates at its highest level. Not by force, but by defining the boundaries of the possible. The more Hayes observed, the more he realized something horrifying. The family behaved like an isolated cult, but without the ritual, without the spectacle. This was a cult without robes or chants, a cult built from silence and scripture, isolation, and obedience. The patriarch had designed a world so airtight that even the daughter's inner thoughts seemed anchored to his gaze. Think about what that means. Imagine a life where every belief you hold is handed to you by a single authority. Imagine growing up with no peers, no teachers, no neighbors, no church, no community, nothing but one man's voice shaping the edges of your mind. Reality becomes whatever that voice allows. That is not faith. That is conditioning. That is not family. That is dominion. As the doctor rode away from the ranch that evening, he felt the air lighten with every mile he put between himself and that house. But the silence followed him. So did the realization that the frontier wasn't just wild because of nature, it was wild because, in places like the Hargrove Ranch, civilization had never arrived. What he saw could not be forgotten, and what he suspected could not be spoken. The descent had begun. By now, you should feel the weight settling in the way knowledge presses against the mind, unyielding, uncomfortable. This is not a story of ordinary crimes. It is a story of absolute control, of how a single man can bend reality inside the walls of a home so isolated that the world outside might as well not exist. Josiah Hargrove did not merely raise children. He engineered minds. He manipulated perception. He created obedience so complete that those under his roof could not conceive of a life beyond his authority. The doctor's journal notes reveal the mechanism of this domination. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet pervasive. Every room arranged to minimize independence, every interaction monitored, every question directed back to the patriarch. Even the youngest seemed to consult him with their eyes before speaking. Their thoughts, actions, and voices were extensions of his will. And yet, to the world outside, the ranch was simply another isolated homestead, a place too remote for interference, too ordinary to attract suspicion. That is how secrecy thrives. Hidden in plain sight, invisible to anyone who assumes normalcy. And then there was the fire. Not a house fire, but a courthouse fire decades later that destroyed records the world might have used to understand the full scope of the Hargrove control. Official documents vanished, witnesses fell silent or disappeared, and the story that remained was carefully sanitized, reduced to rumor. But fragments survived. Letters, journal entries, and whispered testimonies preserved in private hands. These fragments speak not of individual acts, but of systems of obedience, of psychological domination, of silence enforced across generations. What is remarkable and terrifying is the efficiency of this system. The daughters, the neighbors, the occasional outsider, the town officials, they all participated in its maintenance, whether through fear, ignorance, or indifference. Isolation and authority worked together to suppress dissent. Even a physician, trained to observe and record, was bound by the invisible walls of this system, unsure how far he could push before stepping into danger. And that is what true power looks like. Subtle, invisible, nearly impossible to confront. The frontier itself becomes a shield. Law becomes an echo, morality becomes negotiable. Control, when combined with isolation and secrecy, transcends the ordinary. It becomes absolute. By understanding the Hargrove Ranch, you begin to see a pattern that exists far beyond any single house. You begin to see how systems, psychological, social, institutional, can bend reality for those trapped inside. And you realize that knowledge itself, once acquired, transforms the observer. You are no longer outside. You are now part of the descent. Now we step beyond the walls of the Hargrove Ranch and into the machinery that protected it, the system of law, silence, and complicity that ensured nothing was ever exposed. Frontier justice, they called it. But frontier justice was not about fairness or truth. It was about convenience, survival, and the preservation of order, or what appeared to be order. The county sheriff, the few local officials, even neighbors, all understood a fundamental rule. A man's home was his castle, and interference was dangerous, costly, and socially unthinkable. Josiah Hargrove lived within that loophole, exploiting it to a level most could not imagine. The physician tried to report what he had seen, carefully phrasing it as concern for health and welfare. But the sheriff leaned back in his chair and smiled, that small, knowing smile of those who understood the frontier too well. "Unless one of those girls comes to me directly," he said, I got no cause to ride out there. A man's house is his castle. And just like that, the machinery of silence clicked into place. Power did not always come from violence. Sometimes it came from indifference, from the system itself refusing to act. And the letters, the fragments hidden for decades, tell the rest of the story. Written in secret, in trembling handwriting, the eldest daughter reached beyond her confinement to communicate truths that no one else could speak aloud. "We are not free to speak," she wrote. "He watches always. But you have seen what no outsider has witnessed. You must know." These were not pleas for rescue, they were coded confessions, fragments of knowledge, evidence of a mind alive beneath domination, yet trapped in a world of silence. The fire at the courthouse years later destroyed much of the legal trace of this family. Witnesses, already terrified, became unreliable. Official accounts were lost, manipulated, or rewritten. In the void left by burned documents, rumor became history. And in that gap, the Hargrove story became myth, a dark whisper of absolute control, moral corruption, and frontier impunity. Notice this: power often survives by hiding in shadows, by shaping belief, by controlling perception. The Hargrove case did not end because justice failed. It ended because truth became optional. Civilization could not reach it. And yet, pieces of it remain: letters, journals, the whispers of those who survived. They remind us that some knowledge, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. If you are still with me, take a moment and write this in the comments twice. I see the hidden, not as a game, not as superstition, but as a marker, a symbol that you are stepping beyond ordinary perception and acknowledging the reality of control, secrecy, and the forbidden. This is your first step into understanding the structures that govern what is seen and what is never allowed to be seen. Now we enter the heart of the Hargrove system, the architecture of obedience. What you are about to understand is subtle, insidious, and terrifying, not because it is violent, but because it is invisible. Power, true power, is not always wielded with force. It is often woven into the very fabric of perception, so that those who live under it do not recognize it as oppression. The daughters of the Hargrove ranch had learned to navigate this invisible architecture from birth. Their minds, their choices, their sense of possibility, all had been shaped by a single authority, until freedom was not only denied, it became inconceivable. The doctor's journal describes it in chilling terms. These were not frightened children, they were conditioned participants in a world defined entirely by the patriarch. Even small gestures, even the act of speaking, were calibrated against a measure of obedience. Autonomy had been erased, replaced by a precise, almost ritualized submission. It was as if the house itself, the routines, the schedules, and the father's constant presence had acted as an unseen hand, molding thought and behavior. They did not resist because resistance was unthinkable. They did not question because questioning had been removed from the spectrum of reality. This is a system familiar to anyone who studies the mechanics of control, though few admit it. Fear alone is temporary. Threat alone is brittle. But isolation, repetition, ritualized authority, and psychological reinforcement create an almost permanent imprint. It is subtle, almost invisible to outsiders, yet it reshapes the mind in ways that are irreversible. The Hargrove daughters were, in a way, living embodiments of this principle, human mirrors reflecting absolute domination. And yet, within the cracks of that control, signs of awareness remained. The eldest daughter's secret letters, smuggled through intermediaries, reveal a mind reaching beyond confinement, calculating the possibilities of communication, and testing the boundaries of the world she had been trapped in. She knew the machinery of obedience intimately. She knew how it functioned, how it kept everyone compliant, and she knew how to push against it without breaking the fragile structure around her. In other words, she had learned the rules of the system and she had begun to manipulate them. The terrifying lesson is clear. The more absolute a system of control becomes, the more invisible it is to the untrained eye. Outsiders see obedience, normalcy, routine. But those inside experience a different reality, a reality where free will is a memory, where the very perception of choice is denied. Understanding this is dangerous because once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize it in other places, in other structures, and in other minds. By now, you should feel it. The descent is accelerating. The isolation, the silence, the manipulation, it is no longer just a historical curiosity. It is a lens, and through it the world looks different. You are beginning to see what others ignore. Now we confront the structures beyond the ranch, the institutions that made this nightmare possible. You must understand, the Hargrove case was not an anomaly because of one man's cruelty. It was an anomaly because the world outside chose not to see. Frontier law, local authorities, even the scattered community, each played a role in sustaining the silence. Power survives not just in isolation, but in the willful blindness of those who could intervene. And in 1854 Texas, that willful blindness was institutionalized. The sheriff, the only representative of law in 100 square miles, was bound by precedent and social expectation. "A man's house is his castle," he said, leaning back, almost smiling. No report, no accusation, no outsider's observation could compel him to act. And so, law became complicity. Justice became a suggestion, never a requirement. This is the lesson few want to admit. Legal systems can protect not just the innocent, but the guilty, especially when power is cloaked in perceived righteousness. Even the church, a potential counterbalance, failed. Ministers were cautious, deferential, afraid of confrontation in a wilderness where reputation and influence were everything. One priest, consulted in secret, admitted he would act in Europe, where authority and law intersected with morality. But here, what can be proven? He asked quietly. Proof was elusive, and without it, silence became obedience. The frontier did not reward moral courage. It rewarded survival. And survival, in this context, meant ignoring the impossible. The Hargrove daughters were at the center of this system, but they were not alone. They were surrounded by a network of fear, indifference, and strategic ignorance. Servants, neighbors, and even traveling merchants became unintentional enforcers of control simply by not intervening. Isolation was powerful, but its survival depended on this web, the quiet acceptance of everyone who might have acted, but chose not to. And yet, fragments of truth persisted. Letters, journals, and burned records that partially survived hint at the reality that law, morality, and faith were insufficient defenses against an individual who mastered isolation and authority. They remind us that systems can fail not because they are weak, but because they are blind to the subtle forms of domination. Here is where your awareness matters. You are no longer a passive observer. You are beginning to recognize the invisible mechanisms that allow power to operate unchecked. You can see how isolation, psychological conditioning, and institutional inaction combine to create realities that are almost impossible to challenge. Take a moment now. Write this in the comments twice. I recognize the unseen. Do it deliberately. It is a symbolic step, a mark of awareness, a way to anchor yourself in the understanding that power often hides in the spaces between action and inaction, in silence and compliance. Now we approach the edge of the story, the point where the machinery begins to falter not because justice arrived, but because systems of control are never perfect. Even the most meticulously engineered domains of obedience contain cracks. The Hargrove Ranch, isolated and absolute, was no exception. The patriarch's authority had been reinforced for years, yet the eldest daughter discovered the one vulnerability that all tyrannies share. Knowledge can escape. Her letters, written in secrecy, are the first evidence that the system was not invincible. Carefully encoded, deliberately delayed, these notes bypassed the eyes and ears of the patriarch, the sheriff, even the neighbors. She had learned the rules of his control, yet she also learned the art of subversion. Within the walls, she moved as expected. Outside those walls, through written words, she extended her consciousness into a world he could not dominate. She became a conduit, a ghost whispering truths that threatened the invisible hierarchy he had built. And the doctor, summoned into the heart of the system, became an unwitting witness and participant. His oath, his training, and his curiosity intersected in a moment of exposure that neither the patriarch nor the world outside could fully control. He saw the daughter's conditioned obedience, the absolute authority, the silence of the neighbors, but he also glimpsed the sparks of awareness, the fragile but undeniable assertion of self that refused to be fully extinguished. That was the weakness. That was the crack. Even decades later, fragments of this truth persisted. Burned records left shadows of documents. Rumors whispered through generations. Survivors remembered just enough to hint at the reality that had been erased in public memory. The Hargrove Ranch became a myth, a cautionary tale of the invisible power of isolation and authority. But for those willing to see, the myth contained lessons far more profound than any courtroom record ever could. It was a study in control, in compliance, and in the subtle ways obedience can be maintained and broken. Here is the crucial point. Knowledge itself becomes a tool. Once you understand the mechanisms at work, the psychological conditioning, the isolation, the societal complicity, you cannot unsee them. You begin to recognize the same patterns in other places. In institutions, in families, in organizations, even within yourself. The Hargrove system is not just history. It is a mirror. It shows what happens when power is unchecked, when silence is weaponized, and when obedience becomes a law unto itself. By seeing this, you have stepped further into forbidden knowledge. The descent is nearly complete. And once you grasp the mechanisms, once you see the cracks, you begin to understand that the world is far more malleable and far more dangerous than most people ever admit. This is the final layer, the deepest descent. By now, you understand the mechanics. Isolation, authority, silence, and complicity. You have seen how one man, armed with conviction and secrecy, could bend the world inside a single house. But the ultimate truth is darker. The Hargrove Ranch was not merely a historical anomaly. It was a template, a demonstration of how power operates when left unchallenged, how control can be absolute, and how systems legal, social, psychological can fail those trapped within them. The patriarch built a universe where reality itself was defined by his will. Inside that universe, nothing existed except obedience. Outside, the world remained oblivious, convinced law and morality were sufficient defenses. But what the Hargrove case shows is that reality is what those in power say it is, and silence is the shield that protects it. The daughters, the neighbors, the sheriff, even the doctor, they were all pieces in a system too vast and subtle for most to perceive. And that is the terrifying lesson. Domination does not require cruelty alone. It requires invisibility, complicity, and the slow erosion of independent thought. The fragments that survive the journals, the letters, the whispered rumors are evidence not of what was done, but of how control persists, how systems of obedience endure, and how knowledge becomes dangerous. Knowledge, once acquired, is transformative. Once you recognize the patterns, the structures, and the psychological architecture of domination, you cannot unsee them. You begin to see the unseen in your own world, in institutions, in human behavior, in yourself. You recognize the cracks, the compliance, the silent complicity that allows power to operate unchecked. And here is the final revelation. Those who live under control may appear passive, may appear resigned, but the mind is resilient. Sparks of awareness, however small, can travel across boundaries, through letters, whispers, and secrets. Even in the most tightly controlled environments, understanding finds a way. That is why the letters survived. That is why the story reached you. Knowledge always escapes even when the world pretends it cannot. Now, after everything you have absorbed, you must decide how you act on this understanding. The descent is complete, but the transformation is only beginning. Recognize the systems. Understand the silences. See the invisible hierarchies. And remember this, the most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that changes the observer. You have glimpsed the machinery of absolute control. You have walked its corridors and seen its architecture. You cannot unsee it. You cannot return to ignorance. And that is precisely why this story matters. Step back, reflect, and carry this awareness deliberately. You now see the world differently. The forbidden is no longer distant. It is a lens through which you will interpret everything. The descent ends, but the awakening has only begun. Step inside the Hargrove Ranch, if you dare. Comment, "I see the hidden," and "I recognize the unseen," to claim your awareness. Share this video if you want the world to know that some truths were never meant to be forgotten. Subscribe now to descend further into forbidden history, lost knowledge, and the secrets the world tried to erase.